Hi, my name is Dr. Joe Childs. I'm a board-certified chiropractic neurologist, and on this DVD today, I'm going to talk to you about dyslexia. I'm going to talk to you about treating children and teenagers, or even adults, with reading troubles or dyslexic issues through a functional neurologic perspective and also a functional medicine perspective. So that's what we're going to talk to you about today. We're going to talk to you about our dyslexia program and how we help kids with these issues. Now, if you're watching this video today, either you or a loved one or your child or your teenager is suffering with dyslexia, suffering with a reading disorder, and you're looking for information, you're looking for answers. You've probably tried everything. You've been to the tutoring, and you've been the child psychologist, and you've done all this type of thing, and you're looking for some answers. What I'm going to tell you is the information I'm going to go over today. No other doctor before has ever told you this information. This is going to be new information. This is cutting-edge information on treating kids with neurological issues, one of those being dyslexia. That's what we're going to focus on today. Let me tell you a little bit about myself before I go into talking about dyslexia. Again, I'm a board-certified chiropractic neurologist. Now, most people think of chiropractors as only treating back pain and neck pain and headaches and things like that, or if you get into a car accident, you go see a chiropractor. And that, we do that type of thing, but you can specialize in chiropractic. Just like you can specialize in medicine and you can become a medical neurologist, in chiropractic you can become a board-certified chiropractic neurologist. That means that we actually take a board and we go about an additional 2.5 years of schooling beyond the chiropractic education, which is about 7 to 8 years in itself. The difference between us and a medical neurologist is we don't treat with drugs or surgery. We treat with nutritional care, and we treat with specific types of brain exercises and brain stimulations. We're going to talk about that today and how that can affect and help your child that has a reading problem or dyslexia. The other thing about me, again, I was a doctor of chiropractic before I became a chiropractic neurologist. I'm fellowship trained in functional neurology. Functional neurology is drugless neurology. It's treating people with neurological problems, neurodevelopmental issues without drugs and surgery. I've also been fellowship trained in childhood neurodevelopmental disorders and how to treat them. In chiropractic neurology, you can even specialize further and learn how to treat childhood neurodevelopmental disorders and pediatrics, and I've been through that training as well. I'm also trained in functional nutrition and functional medicine, which is nutritional care for chronic conditions and neurological conditions. I've been trained in blood chemistry, and that's training in how to read blood labs and stool labs and things like that. And we do those types of things. We're going to talk about that today on this video. Beyond helping kids with these neurodevelopmental disorders, I've also been trained in spinal decompression, spinal biomechanics, and prior to becoming a chiropractor or chiropractic neurologist, I was an exercise physiologist. So let's get started. So what makes us different from every other doctor your child have seen, or any other tutor your child has seen, or any other school psychologist? What makes us different? Well, what makes us different is we treat your child's dyslexia metabolically and neurologically. The research on dyslexia has come out that it is a neurobiological problem. That means there are specific areas in your child's brain that is causing him not to be able to read as well. Biological means there is a metabolic cause. There is no genetic test to find this. It is not a genetic issue. It is an environmental and a neurological based problem, and we're going to talk about that. So this is what makes us different. We treat your child metabolically and neurologically. You're not going to get this anywhere else. We're going to talk about that today. We want to get to the root cause, and we want to leave no stone unturned in finding out why your child is having trouble with verbal skills or reading, and why they've been diagnosed with this dyslexic issue. I mean, if you're watching this video, you're concerned about your child, and you're looking for some answers. We're going to go over that with you. So what is dyslexia? Well, dyslexia is a language-based disability in which a person has trouble understanding the written words. It may also be referred to as a reading disability or a reading disorder. Okay? A couple facts about dyslexia. It's the most common cause of reading, writing, and spelling difficulties. Of people with poor reading skills, 70 to 80% of them can be diagnosed with what we call dyslexia. A couple more facts about dyslexia. 1 in 5 students, or 15 to 20% of the population, has some type of language-based learning disability. Dyslexia is one of those. Nearly the same percentage of males and females have the problem. So it's not like ADHD, which is another neurodevelopmental disorder, which we also treat quite a bit in our office. That's more skewed towards males or boys. And also the socioeconomic background or the ethnic background of an individual, there is no difference there, meaning it is just as even in all of these populations. So that's pretty interesting. What is dyslexia? Well, it is a specific learning disorder that, again, is neurological in origin. So it has to do with the way the brain is functioning. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition, meaning they're having trouble either speaking or reading these words, and by poor spelling. Typically these kids are going to have a lot of trouble with spelling issues, and they're going to also have decoding inability, or very poor decoding ability. All right, so what is the functional versus the traditional diagnosis? Well, the traditional diagnosis is usually done by a school psychologist or teacher. We find that the child is below their average reading age, so they may be in like 5th grade and they're only reading at a 2nd grade level, and that's how they determine that the child has poor reading skills or verbal learning disability or dyslexia, which are typically not going to use the word dyslexia. So they're not really looking at the part of the brain that's causing it. Now, the functional diagnosis is we want to look at the areas of the brain that are involved in a child that is not functioning well or not reading well. Excuse me. And basically, usually it's always the left side of the brain. It could be the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, and we can do specific testing to figure out which part of the child's brain is weaker, causing these issues. So that's the difference between a functional. Functional says, what is the neurological origin of the problem, where a traditional is just sort of a label that they put on your child. So what is dyslexia? Again, well, using the functional imaging, researchers have found, they know that the reading disability involves a weakness in the part of the brain that decodes the written language. So there's a part of the brain. And what they found is this area sits above the left ear. It's right around this area right here. And it's at the junction between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. It's called the word form area. It's between these two areas. Now, the parietal lobe is an area for sense of touch, but it also has a lot to do with taking information, especially on the left side, the left temporal and parietal lobe. It allows language to be sort of understood, and then it gets sent up to the frontal lobe for there to be a motor response or for speaking. The temporal lobe is smell and memory. And so this little area right in here, again, is the word form area. This area is the word form area of the left temporal and parietal lobe. It lights up very brightly when you do fMRI studies on brain scans of normal readers. However, it's not so bright, or it's very dim in poor readers because it's less active. So kids that are poor readers, this area is not functioning as well. It's almost like a weak muscle. It's out of sync. Okay? People with dyslexia, this word form area stays largely weak or dormant. For them, every word remains a puzzle. So it's actually, your child has a weak area in their brain that allows them or inhibits them from being a good reader. Okay? It's called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means that certain areas of the brain can become stronger, but in this case there is poor neuroplasticity for some reason. And in that area, that part of the brain is weak in children, or dormant in children. It's not developing properly in children with reading issues. Okay? And this is what the research is saying on these areas. So again, what is dyslexia? When we first learn to read, it can be very effortful. Okay, but as we learn to read and we look at the words enough, those nerve endings in these areas become very strong. They become plastic. They become more efficient. And then it's stored in this word form area. So words get stored in these areas, and so you can retrieve them easily. So it's easier for them to retrieve. The more you learn to read, this area becomes stronger, and then it's easier for a child when they see a word, it instantly comes up as something that they've seen before. Okay? So what happens is dyslexia is a retrieval problem based on poor brain timing, meaning that there's timing issues between the left and the right hemisphere. And that area, the word form area, is not as developed as it needs to be. So we're going to talk about that and how we can affect that. So what we call this is a functional disconnection syndrome between the left and the right side of the brain. If you're going to understand dyslexia or any neurodevelopmental disorder in children, you have to understand the difference between the left and the right side of the brain. A functional disconnection syndrome means that the left or the right side of the brain, one of those sides, is weaker than the other. And so what happens is you get a child that has very good skills with the strong side and very poor skills with the weak side. And we're going to go over the difference between the left and the right brain and the attributes or the skills that that side of the brain has. So a functional disconnection syndrome means that the areas in the brain, especially the two hemispheres of the brain, are not electrically balanced or synchronized, meaning they're not functioning at the same speed or same level. It's kind of like you can sit there and watch an orchestra and you have all of the instruments on one side of the orchestra and all the instruments on the other side of the orchestra. Imagine that if all the instruments are playing, however, on the left side of the orchestra you have instruments that are playing out of tune or playing slower. What's going to happen is the music is not going to sound right. Even though they're playing, but they're playing out of tune. So that's what I mean by synchronization. It's a timing. Okay? Dyslexia, again, is a neurological timing problem that causes this to occur. It causes a child to have poor reading. Now I want you to understand that not all brain cells are directly connected. Okay? Not all of them are actually connected by another nerve. You know, everybody thinks that when you look at a nerve that this area of the brain is connected to that area by a pathway or another nerve. And that's typically the way it is. But some nerves or some brain cells are connected. In fact, all the brain cells are connected by this synchronization, this timing mechanism. It's called temporal coherence. And so they're connected through timing. We call it synchronization. And so you can have one whole hemisphere that's completely out of sync with the other side. That, again, is called a functional disconnection syndrome. The term has been around for many years. It is becoming one of the hot topics in functional neurology. It's been studied by this guy, Dr. Malio. He's actually the doctor that trained me through the Carrick Institute. And basically, when we look at a functional disconnection syndrome, it's an electrical imbalance that interferes with the ability of the two hemispheres to share and integrate information, meaning the brain cannot function as a whole. So there is a disconnect between both sides. So the wiring is there, meaning the left and the right brain are actually able to talk with each other, but they're out of sync with each other. So it's not a structural problem, it's a functional problem. In order for the human brain to function as a whole, the left and the right hemisphere must be in constant communication. In order to communicate effectively, the two sides must be able to keep up with each other. They must be synchronized. So the trouble with dyslexia is there's a weakness in the left side of the brain, which is the language side of the brain. That's where the word form area is, between the parietal and temporal lobe. You have to fix the neurology. You can't just educate the child more and more and more and harder. You actually have to fix the neurology to allow him to have a platform to take in that education. We'll explain that more as we go. The functional disconnection syndrome, left brain deficiencies are dyslexia, learning disabilities, auditory processing disorders, central auditory processing. The left side of the brain processes the verbal information. When somebody speaks to you, that gets processed on the left side. That's why we have central auditory processing. A lot of these kids have auditory processing disorders as well as dyslexia, and it's because that left side of the brain is in control of that. Dyspraxia, which is having trouble combining motor movements or activities. Language disorder, dysgraphia, which is poor handwriting, and that's because the handwriting centers are usually going to be on the left side, the word form area, and acalcula, which means poor skills in doing simple math problems and things like that. Your functional disconnection on the right brain, you're going to get things like ADD and ADHD, you're going to get Asperger's syndrome, you're going to have PDD-NOS, autism, Tourette's syndrome. These are all right brain issues. We treat these as well. And I actually have a video on ADD and ADHD and Asperger's, and you can look at that if you know somebody that has that type of problem. But today we're going to talk about more left brain issues. So let's talk about the left versus the right side of the brain. Now, The right side of the brain is the brake pedal. The left side of the brain is the gas pedal. It is the approach side of the brain. So some kids with dyslexia and things like that may be a little shyer, a little, if their left brain is weaker, the gas pedal's not on, they may sort of go into things a little slower. Where the right side of the brain, if you have a weak right brain, that's going to be an ADD kid. The brake pedal's off. I mean, they're just really high energy usually. The left side of the brain is the approach response. It initiates movement. It initiates thought. So you can see how you can have some learning disabilities. The right side of the brain is the withdrawal process, stopping thought, stopping movement. So you can see how somebody with ADHD is going to be having a hard time withdrawing from other stimuli. They're constantly being stimulated. The left hemisphere controls your fine motor skills like handwriting and things like that. So a lot of times these kids will have poor handwriting, poor fine motor skills, okay, where the right side is gross motor skills. Left side of the hemisphere is high frequency stimulation, right side is low frequency. The left side of the brain is the what part of the brain. It's about facts, it's about figures, and that's why we can have learning disability, because they have a hard time with facts and figures and things like that. The memorization of facts, where the right side of the brain is more nonlinear. It's big picture. The left side of the brain is, again, linear. It's verbal fluency. It's being able to look at numbers and letters and all the coding and things like that. That's the left side of the brain. Where right side of the brain is more big picture. Okay? The left side of the brain likes routine. It likes things the same. And it's the happy side of the brain, where the right side of the brain is more for comprehension. So the left side of the brain is actually reading. The right side of the brain is taking that reading and comprehending it. So a kid with a reading disorder means he actually has trouble reading. Now we do something in our office called the Taylor Visiograph. I'm going to demonstrate this later in the video. But the Taylor Visiograph is going to actually look at your child's ability to read and be able to look at their eye movements. And I'm going to talk about that as we go. But it's very important for you to understand that. But the right side of the brain is comprehending the reading. Left side is actually reading. Okay? The left brain is verbal communication. It's word reading, it's math calculations, it's processing information, especially auditory. It receives auditory input. And it's also the curious, more the impulsive side of the brain. So you can see in a child with a weak right brain and a strong left brain, they're going to be maybe a little bit more impulsive. Okay? When the left brain is out of balance, you're going to have a child that's late in learning how to speak. And you can kind of look back at your child or teenager with a reading issue and say, well, you know what, he didn't really speak as quickly as we would have liked to have seen. Difficulty in pronouncing words. Sensory problems, meaning they may not be able to hear things as well. They can hear fine, but sounds may not be processed as well. Okay? And difficulty spelling. That's the hallmark of somebody with dyslexia. Okay? When the brain is out of balance, you may have poor gross or poor fine motor skills. They may be left-handed, right-footed. A healthy brain will have the vision, the hearing, the foot dominance, and the hand dominance all on one side. A lot of times kids with a left brain imbalance will have, they'll be using their left eye, they may use their right ear, they may use their left foot and their right hand. And so the reason why that creates problems is because that creates a processing issue, meaning we need to take the vision information, bring it across to the right side. At the same time, hearing has to cross this way, so it's going to the opposite side. So it's a processing speed issue, meaning it has to get to the other side, and it's not all landing on one hemisphere. And so that can create some learning disabilities and things like that. Poor eye coordination. Reading issues almost always have coordinated eye movements, and we do something called the Taylor Visiograph to determine that. Poor handwriting. Difficulty putting ideas on paper. Okay? Messy, unorganized, trouble hearing the sounds and words. What they found that with kids with dyslexia or reading issues, sometimes they can't hear the beginning letters of words, and so they don't hear that consonant sound or that vowel sound. They may have what's called persistent primitive motor reflexes. Now, primitive reflexes, what are primitive reflexes? Well, as a baby, when a baby is born, they have these reflexes. They're survivability reflexes. This is when the neurologist or the pediatric neurologist checks your child, and he kind of scrapes the bottom of his toe to see if the bottom of his foot to see if the toe sticks up. That's a Babinski reflex, where they kind of go like this to see if the child's will start to root and look for the breast, or they'll go like this in the hand, and the child hand grasps. That's called a grasp or palmar reflex. They'll take the baby and they'll kind of turn them to see if the arms move to protect, or they'll kind of drop the baby back to see if they startle, or they'll rub their lower back to see if they kind of bend to the left or right. That's called a gallant reflex. That's there, so as the baby's coming down through the vaginal canal, what will happen is as the vaginal wall rubs against the child's back, they kind of push this way and push that way, and that's how they get out of, that's how they birth themselves, or how they help birthing. Okay, so these are primitive reflexes. Well, in childhood, if we do not inhibit the primitive reflexes, they are going to inhibit proper development of the motor system and thus the brain. The brain will not fully mature. This can cause learning disabilities, ADHD, dyslexia, things like that. So these primitive reflexes are good for the infant. They're there for survivability of the infant. But within a year, all these reflexes should be completely gone. If the frontal lobes and if the brain is developing properly, these reflexes should be what we call remediated. They should be gone. But if the child's brain is not developing properly and these reflexes have not been remediated through proper stimulation of the child, what will happen is they will have persistent primitive reflexes. And so what we do in our office is we test for these persistent primitive reflexes. And you can see with some kids with learning disabilities, they will have reflexes that are still there. They may have what's called the asymmetric tonic neck. You turn their head and their arms move with their body. They may still have this gallant reflex. They may still have a little bit of a rooting reflex or a Babinski reflex. That's not good because, as we look here, if they're not inhibited, these reflexes will inhibit proper development of the motor system, and they're going to affect the way the brain matures. Okay, so we need to have proper motor development if we're going to have proper cognitive development and proper thought development. So timing in the brain is a byproduct of proper timing in the motor system, synchronization. So if the motor system doesn't develop properly, whether it be fine motor, whether it be balance systems, whether it be gross motor, whether it be these reflexual systems and they're not remediated properly, then you're not going to get proper brain development, and it's going to affect the timing mechanism, and then we get a functional disconnection syndrome. So dyslexia is a neurodevelopmental disorder. The studies on dyslexia, if you Google them, they're going to say it's a neurobiological problem. It's a metabolic problem. So we need to treat the child with fuel and activation. Fuel is the metabolic side. We need to make sure that your child doesn't have hypoglycemia. We want to make sure that the brain is getting enough fuel. If your child's brain is going to develop properly, it needs to have proper fuel, glucose and oxygen, and it needs to have proper stimulation through brain-based rehabilitation. That's metabolic care and neurologic-based care. Fuel and activation. That's how we help a child with neurodevelopmental disorders. So again, we treat dyslexia neurologically and metabolically. So let's talk about metabolic care. We're going to run a complete metabolic panel. We're going to run a lipid panel. We're going to run a complete blood count with autodifferential. We're going to run a thyroid panel. We're going to look at thyroid antibodies. Okay. Now we always get, well, doc, I've already had these on my son and everything's completely fine. Well, here's the difference. From a functional neurologic or functional nutritional approach, we want to look at your lab panels from the functional or optimal range. There is a laboratory range and there is a functional range. The laboratory range is all the reference ranges that you see when you get your blood work done on the right side of the page. And it'll say, well, are you in this range or out of this range? Well, where they get that laboratory range is it's the average of everybody giving blood work. So if you go over to a Quest and you look at people giving blood work, there's some pretty unhealthy people in there. Those ranges are the average of everybody. What we want to look at is the optimal range. Now, the optimal range is the range of only healthy people. Okay, so it's a lot tighter, it's a lot stronger. So, like, for instance, blood sugar. Blood sugar normal is 85 to 100. That's the optimal range. Where the laboratory range is 65 to about 105. And so you can see that's a lot broader. So you can have a child that has reactive hypoglycemia, and it may be totally affecting their learning ability, but as long as it's coming in within that 65 to 110 range, and let's say it comes in at 66, they're going to say that's normal. But it's not normal. It's called reactive low blood sugar or hypoglycemia. So that's the difference between functional versus laboratory ranges. So we want to look at that. We can run something called an adrenal stress index, especially on teenagers. There's a lot of stress with these with these kids, and it looks at the adrenal glands. It's a salivary test. It's going to let us know if your child has high cortisol or low cortisol and how that affects his sugar balance. It's a special test that we do. We can run sensitivity testing. Sensitivity testing is essential. A lot of these kids have brain inflammation because of the fact that they are eating foods that they are sensitive to and that their own immune system is attacking. The big five is gluten, casein, egg, soy, and yeast. So we want to test for antibodies. It's called tissue transglutaminase for gluten. We want to see, is your child gluten sensitive? Gluten, what will happen is it's a protein, and it'll get through the digestive tract. When it gets through the digestive tract, if it gets through there, it gets into the bloodstream, your own immune system or your child's own immune system will think that that molecule is a foreign invader like a bacteria or virus, and it'll start to mount an attack against it. And that creates autoimmunity or self-immunity, meaning that your own immune system is attacking yourself, and it creates inflammation. A lot of these kids have a lot of food sensitivities that are affecting their ability to learn and for their brain to develop. So we want to test for these things. We want to test for a leaky gut. Now what a leaky gut is this. Basically, your gut, when you look at the gut wall, the intestinal wall, the colon, and things like that, is a separation from the food that's coming through and the bloodstream. So there is a gut wall. And that gut wall is kind of like a screen door in that the only thing that should get through that screen door or that gut is healthy stuff, fully digested particles. So if you look at a screen door, the only thing that should get through the screen door is air. The bug should stay inside. Well, if your gut is leaky, and it can become leaky because of excessive stress, or it can become leaky because of poor diet. It can become leaky because of excessive antibiotic use, which increases yeast load and things like that. A lot of these kids have had ear infections and things like that as kids. And you know, I talk to a lot of kids that come in, or parents with neurodevelopmental children, and yeah, they've had 5 or 6 ear infections. They've had tubes, this, that, and the other. Well, that kills healthy bacteria, and then that creates yeast overgrowth, and then the yeast weakens the wall of the intestinal tract. And so what happens is now protein molecules, instead of being fully digested, are making it through the leaky gut. And now instead of being, the only thing that should get through that gut are small protein molecules. So a protein gets digested down to a peptide, which gets digested down to an amino acid. And the only thing that should flow through is the amino acid. And then the immune system will go past it because you won't be able to detect something as small as an amino acid. Well, if your gut is leaky, what will go through are large protein molecules or peptides. They'll get through the gut because it's leaky, kind of like the bugs can get in, and now through the screen door. And what will happen is these whole protein molecules come in, and what will happen is now the immune system will attack that, thinking that it's a foreign invader like a virus or bacteria. So the leaky gut makes the food sensitivity that much worse. And the big five are gluten, casein, soy. These are the proteins that your child can be sensitive to. Well, that can affect your child's brain because that sensitivity can turn into what's called gliadomorphine and caseomorphine, and that gets up into your child's brain and it can affect their brain function and inflammation. Okay, this is cutting-edge information. You're not going to hear this from the medical doctor that wants to put a child on drug. But guess what? There is no drug for dyslexia. There's drugs for ADD and ADHD, but there's really no drugs for dyslexia. Food sensitivity to gluten and casein can cause irritability, occasional meltdowns, inability to focus or concentrate, impulsive actions, aggressive behavior, fatigue, children with bedwetting, sleep problems, learning disabilities, lack of attention, lack of focus, hyperactivity, poor digestion, cognitive symptoms, executive, frontal lobe functions, compromised immune system. These are all things from food sensitivities. The other thing that we can run is we can run immune panels. Immune panels gives us an in-depth picture of how your child's immune system is functioning. Again, the immune system is that which attacks foreign invaders, and sometimes that immune system can be attacking these food particles. And so the immune system is key. We'll run something called a TMB lymphocyte test. We'll run cytokine panels, interleukin 2, TNF-alpha, interleukin 4, interleukin 10, and natural killer cell activity. There's two parts of your immune system. There's the Th1 side and the Th2 side. Th1 side are your helper cells, Th1, and they're your T cells. They go out and do the attacking of these molecules or these viruses or bacteria. Then you have Th2. That is the antibodies, and so it needs to be balanced. And so what can happen is we can have a child that has a real high Th1 that's creating a lot of inflammation, and a low Th2. That's an imbalance in the immune system, and that can cause your child to have brain inflammation and can really affect the development of your child's brain. especially if they have a family history, if they have a mother with hypothyroidism or any type of autoimmune issue. That sometimes can be inherited down. We can determine if your child has an active antigen or immune dysregulation. Active antigens are bacteria, or viruses, or parasites, or molds, or yeast, or fungi, or poor digestive bacteria that you need. They call them probiotics. Chemicals, or heavy metals, or food sensitivities. That's an active antigen that's spurring along your child's immune system. And so we can run what's called a DNA stool ecology. We run that in our office. It's a stool test. It's going to look at your child's. It's going to find out, do they have any parasites, do they have any bacteria, low amounts of bacteria, yeast overgrowth, things like that. And if they have that, we want to clear these things out. Okay. Now a lot of people will say, well, my child already got tested for celiac disease. Celiac disease is it's a genetic allergy to gluten. Now here's the deal. What I'm talking about is gluten sensitivity, not celiac disease. Celiac disease can be detected by blood tests, but gluten sensitivity cannot be detected by blood tests. It needs to be detected by a stool test. And there is some studies that are coming out on a more effective blood test for gluten sensitivity, but when it comes to what your medical doctor is going to test for, they're only going to be testing for celiac disease, which is a really bad intestinal allergy or to gluten. So you need to get a stool test, or if we ever get this research completed and the test becomes perfect, there's a blood test that will be coming out for the gluten sensitivity. We can also screen your child for decreased brain neurotransmitters. Brain neurotransmitters like GABA, like acetylcholine, which is great is a memory neurotransmitter, serotonin, dopamine, things like that. We can test for these things. If your child's low in that, we can give your child some cofactors to help support that. Instead of using drugs, we can use these things. And that can be very important for a child's neurodevelopmental disorders. Glutathione and nutritional supplements. Once we figure out what's going on with your child's internal chemistry, then we're going to come up with a specific diet nutritional protocol that's going to allow his brain to develop as best it can and allow his brain to be as healthy as it can. So we use specific types of non-drug nutritional products or preparations that can really affect your child's gut health. And the other thing is we want to get him off any of these food sensitivities. It's absolutely critical. I mean, if we're going to help your child and he comes back that he's gluten sensitive, that is affecting his brain function. The studies are out on it, and they're going to be coming out stronger and stronger and stronger. So if we find this out, and I'm looking for parents that are willing to, walk through ground glass to help their child with their learning disabilities or their reading issues. If they are gluten sensitive and they have the gene for the gluten sensitivity, they need to be off of this. If they're casein or milk sensitive, we need to, we need to get your child off of these things, or your child isn't going to get healthy. They're not going to get better, and they're not going to start doing good in school. So the question is, has your child with dyslexia, have they had all these tests? And the question is, why not? Now the reason why not is because typically when it comes to dyslexia, all they do is just tutoring and things like that. So you have to address, if dyslexia has been studied, it's a neurobiological problem, it's a neurological metabolic problem, neurodevelopmental problem. It needs to be effective. You need to run these tests if you're going to be doing the best for your child. Now the other thing we do is neurological treatments based on specific neurological tests. So we are going to do specific neurological exam to find out which part of your child's brain is causing the problem. Is it the cerebellum? Is it the temporal and parietal lobe on the left side, which it typically is, the word form area? Is it frontal lobe? Because these areas then fire to the frontal lobe, and maybe it's the processing in the frontal lobe that's causing the problem. We can do specific testing to figure that out. We can do a comprehensive neurological questionnaire. We can do an interactive metronome testing, which is going to be looking at gross motor groups and auditory function. We can do visual, auditory reflexes, autonomic function. We can look at their gait, their posture, their muscle tone, balance and coordination. Primitive reflex testing. We'll run through all those primitive reflexes. And you'll be surprised how many of these reflexes your child comes up with that's actually inhibiting the growth and function of their brain. We can run video nystagmoscopy, which we're actually going to put these infrared goggles on to look at eye movements to see if your child's eye movements are accurate and if they're functioning well. That is a good window into frontal lobe and cerebellar function, which is essential. Spinal examination, cognitive evaluation, analysis of lab tests, things like that. We'll look at previous testing. We'll look at the IQ test, the Wyatt, the WISC, all those different tests that your child get, the PSSAs, you know, all the different standardized testing. Bring that stuff in. So we also do advanced neurological testing for all of our patients with neurodevelopmental disorders, especially those with reading disorders and dyslexia or learning disabilities. So what I'd like to do now is talk to you about our advanced neurological testing that we do. The two advanced neurological tests that we do on all of our patients with reading disorders or dyslexia are video nystagmography and saccadimetry. And basically what these two tests do is they measure ocular motility or eye movements. Studies have shown that patients with dyslexia or reading disorders, they have abnormalities in their eye movements and in their eye tracking. And eye movements are very, very important. Why are they so important? Well, eye movements are the only human physiological function that involve every area of the brain. They involve the frontal lobes, they involve the parietal lobes, they involve the cerebellum, the brainstem. Every aspect of your brain is involved in eye movements. And eye movements have been studied to be off or not proper in patients or in people or children that have reading disorders. And so we want to look at these very heavily. So the first test I'd like to talk about is video nystagmography. And essentially what happens is we put these goggles on the child. They kind of look like dive goggles or swimming goggles or something like that. Most of the children kind of think they're pretty neat. So we put those on, and what will happen is they're going to look at a TV screen where there's going to be various little dots and little balls and different things like that that go up and down and side to side, and they're going to measure various eye movements. And what will happen is they will be printed out on a screen in a graph which will go over abnormalities or areas that are functioning well versus abnormal, and we can look at those and design a program specific to the eye movements that are not proper. So we see, and we'll also get on the TV we'll see the eye movements themselves, and it comes out in a graph. So when we do video nystagmography, we're going to measure a couple things. We're going to measure gaze stability. Gaze stability is the ability for the eyes to focus and fixate on one target. What will happen in children with dyslexia or children with reading disorders, a lot of times their eyes will have jerkiness and they actually are not able to fixate on the target or on the letter or on the word. We also look at nystagmus. Nystagmus is a slow and fast bouncing of the eyes. Some kids have this. They have what's known as congenital nystagmus. We want to determine if that's an issue. We look at pursuits. Pursuits are slow movements back and forth. And again, studies have shown that pursuit mechanism is altered in kids with, or in children with reading disorders. Saccades are probably the most important aspect that we look at. Saccades are fast eye movements. So if I'm looking from this thumb to that thumb, that's a saccade. It's a fast eye movement. And when we read, we saccade from word to word and letter to letter, and it's essential that these work well. So we look at the various aspects of saccades. We'll talk about that a little more deep. Optokinetics is when something moves past you quickly. So it may be some bars that go past, like striped bars, black and white striped bars, and that is your brain's ability to pursue and refixate on target. And then we also look at something called the vestibular ocular reflex. That's if I move my head. If I move my head to the right, my eyes should move equally to the left. And if I move my head to the left, my eyes should move equally to the right. And that's really governed by a part of your brain called the cerebellum, which is the back part of your brain. We talked about that earlier. We also run something called a saccadimeter. Saccadimeter is a strap that we put around the head, and what happens is this will shoot out these little lasers that will go onto the wall. And what we do is we measure saccades very, very precisely with this. We use this in a lot of our, we also see a lot of concussion cases in our office. This is a very important test for concussion cases, but it's also very important for reading and looking at saccades. So what will happen is that harness will actually shoot these little red lasers onto the wall, and the child has to look at each dot as they appear, and it measures the speed of the saccades and it measures how well things are functioning. So what will happen is it will give us a graph. It will give us a green are to the right, which are generated by the left brain. That would be an area that we'd be most concerned about with dyslexia and reading disorders, because it's usually a left brain problem. Or the ones to the left, are the red ones, are generated by the right brain. So we can look at the difference between left and right brain when we look at these saccades. The other thing that we'll look at when we look at a saccanometer is we're going to look at latency. Latency is if I'm looking at this thumb and then this thumb appears or this stimulus appears, it's how long it takes me to take off before I move to the next stimulus or the next dot or whatever I'm supposed to saccade to. Children with dyslexia and things of that nature, they have problems with getting an abnormal long fixation on one word or on one letter, and they can't break to the next, and we call that a latency. Okay? Velocity is the speed that your eyes are able to move. So if you have very slow saccades, you'll be a very slow reader. Accuracy is if I'm looking from here to here, do my eyes go right to the target, or do they pass the target and come back? Do they undershoot the target? So we have undershoots and overshoots, or what we call hypometric saccades or hypermetric saccades. Imagine if your child's trying to read, and every time he tries to read, he passes a word, he undershoots the word. It can become very taxing on the brain. And waveform is kind of a mixture of timing and the speed and all these types of things together. So these are the things we look at with the saccanometer. Very important test. So we take all of the tests that we do in our neurological exam, we take the test from the saccanometer or advanced neurological testing, and we create specific neurological treatments to create neuroplastic changes in the brain, or we would like to make changes in the brain so the brain can function better. So we may do cerebellar stimulation. There is a whole theory on dyslexia. It's called the cerebellar theory of dyslexia, and it states that because the cerebellum controls timing, balance, it controls articulation of speech. If the cerebellum is not developed properly, it can affect reading. And vestibular system is your inner ear system, which is highly connected to balance and coordinated movement. That is also connected to the cerebellum. So we will do cerebellar stimulation specific to the areas of the cerebellum that we find not correct. Or in vestibular is balance training, inner ear training. Again, balance training. We may do hemifield visual stimulation, which is stimulation in different visual stimulation from different hemifields. So if we're trying to affect the left brain, we may use right hemifield stimulation, either in the upper quadrant or lower quadrant. We may do auditory stimulation, which is sound stimulation. Smells, we may do sweet smells in the left side of the nose to affect the left frontal lobe and temporal lobe. Fine motor exercises. The left brain, fine motor, it controls more fine motor, where the right brain controls more gross motor. Interactive metronome is a program I'll talk about in just a moment. And again, all the different specific eye exercises. If there's abnormalities in gaze stability, we have to improve that. If there's abnormalities in saccadic movements, we need to fix those. So we do brain-based treatment. So we may do gross motor. We may do cross-crawl mechanisms to work both hemispheres of the brain. We may do neck exercises, chest exercises. We may do balance exercises. We may do stimulations of the joints with chiropractic care using an instrument on the right side of the body to affect the left brain. Fine motor stimulations. Interactive metronome is a program that uses sensory and motor processing. So they wear these headphones and they have to clap to the beat using rhythm and timing. Rhythm and timing is very important to reading. And so in double-blind study, they found that using interactive metronome, there's significant improvements in attention and concentration, motor control and coordination, language processing, reading fluency, and the control of aggression and impulsivity. We use interactive metronome on a lot of cases. We use it on ADHD cases, we use it on our reading disorder cases, we use it on any of our autism spectrum disorder cases. So it's a very good therapy that we use. Some doctors only use that and get good results. We use that combined with all the various other aspects. This is an example of visual stimulation. We may have checker on one hemisphere, or we may have an eye movement or a pursuit or a saccade. Now here's the deal. Treating dyslexia and reading disorders is a little different than treating ADHD. ADHD, you have a choice of medications. With reading disorders, there's no drug or medication that can help a child. So you're sort of left with only tutoring, and that's about it, or special classroom and stuff of that nature, where we provide a neurological approach. Now, if you only use a cognitive approach, which means only using tutoring or things like that, it's sort of not the best way to do it, because you're not addressing the neurological reason for the problem. Meaning, you can tutor a child all you want and give them a lot of repetition with reading, which is essential and a very good thing to do, but if they still have eye movement abnormalities, if they still have gaze fixation abnormalities, if they still have cerebellar dysfunction, they're not going to get the most out of their tutoring. So development of cognitive areas depends on proper motor development and also sensory inputs first. So how do you treat dyslexia and reading disorders best? Well, how do you fix it? How do you fix these things? Well, you need to do more. We need to step out of the educational approach only and treat them neurologically by improving their brain and nervous system. And then you combine that with the extra reading and tutoring, and that's going to give you your best approach. Neurological brain-based care lays the foundation by creating neuroplastic changes in the brain. It changes the brain by stimulating the areas of the brain that are weak. And what that will do is we'll build a foundation and allow the other therapies to be that much more successful. So when we look at neurological treatment, one of the ways we're different is we want to look at also the metabolic capacity. Not every child can do 45 straight minutes of eye exercises or this. We have to look at that. So when we do a neurological exam, we look at their autonomic function, which is how they're doing blood flow wise, how are they doing with oxygen, different things like that. Do they have tissue perfusion changes? Every child has a different neurological capacity, and that's one thing that we do as functional neurologists, is we have to look at that specifically. It's hemispheric based. We want to find out which side of the brain is the weakest side. Usually these things are caused by a functional disconnection syndrome. Learning disabilities and reading disorders and dyslexia usually is the left brain problem. ADHD and autism spectrum disorder is usually right. Sometimes we find kids that have delays on both sides of their brain, but most of the time there's a hemispheric based aspect. And we want to look at, make sure that it's ocular motor based. The eyes are really you hear the eyes are the window to the soul. They're really the window to the nervous system. Your eyes are the only area of your brain that can be seen from the outside. So it's neurological tissue. So we want to look at the eye movements. That's the best way to find out what is happening in the brain. Other therapies like medications, they're just going to stimulate the brain as a whole and make both sides improve. Where what we want to do is we want to improve the weakness on the side that's weak. Okay? Neurological treatments, usually we see patients 2 to 3 times a week over the course of 6 to 12 weeks. Usually it's about a 45-minute to 1-hour visit. We do home therapies. We're going to give you specific exercises for home. And parents kind of have to work with their children at home, usually maybe 10 minutes a day or so. Most of it's done in office, but home is also important. And if there's any dietary changes, that's important. So we also work with other providers. We're going to work with neuropsychologists. We'll work with your teachers. We will kind of work hand in hand to provide the neurologic and metabolic aspect, and we'll also work with them as if they're working with tutoring or any of that nature. We want to be a team. This is not an alternative to those things. Those things are very good, but this is another aspect that needs to be improved upon to give the best approach for your child. Results, we have extremely good results with our patients. Very high. One of the most successful things that we see in our practice, we see a lot of chronic neurological disorders. The children that we treat, we see some of the best results with, particularly because their brain is so ready to be developed. It's so ready to improve. I mean, it has the best ability to improve being so young. We only accept patients that we believe we can help. That's another reason why we have such a high success rate. So what do we do from here? We went over this long video. You took the time to watch this video. I thank you for that. I would recommend you look at all the other aspects of this site. Look at our advanced neurological testing videos that are on this site. Look at everything on the site that we have here. And then if it turns out that you have any more questions, there's an area on this website where you can put your name and your phone number in and set up a 5-minute over-the-phone consultation where I'll sit down and talk with you about any questions you may have about your child. If you are ready to come into the office, you can also put your name and information in, and we'll send you information on a reduced cost evaluation. If you would like, you could call our office as well. Just you can look at our contact information there and let our front desk staff know that you'd like to set up an appointment time. What do you get? You get a functional brain assessment where we're going to look at any questionnaires. We'll do interactive metronome testing. visual and auditory reflexes. We do autonomic function. We look at your child's gait, their posture, their muscle tone. We're going to look at their balance and coordination. We're going to check for any primitive reflexes, motor performance. We're going to run the advanced neurological testing, which is the saccadimeter, video nystagmography. We'll also do a spinal examination, cognitive evaluation. We'll look at any specific lab tests, and we do any analysis of any previous testing that you may have had. That's what happens in our advanced neurological testing or our brain functional assessment. So essentially, if you're interested in having that done, it's about an hour-and-a-half visit. Just give our office a call. I appreciate you watching this video, and again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call our office. Thank you.